I was first up the sewer hatch and into the alien compound. Next came Wood, the Major, Angelos, and finally Kershane with his M249 machine gun. We exited the cramped sewers into a narrow but very high vaulted ceiling cul-de-sac of sorts. The interior of the alien compound had the smell of strong chemicals, like walking into a janitor's closet when all the tops have been left off the cleaning solutions. It burned my nose slightly and watered my eyes. The walls were made out of the same dark metal as the outside of the building. I guess the aliens didn't really care about interior design much. Lighting was dim and tinted blue, emanating from what seemed like small boxes embedded high up in the ceiling. We knew the elves were nocturnal or had evolved on a dimly lit world, and we'd come prepared with night vision should we need it. We followed the short hallway leading out of the dead end we emerged from until it intersected in another larger hallway. We were under strict orders by Major Holbrook to not open fire on anything unless it was a life or death situation. None of our weapons were silenced, and though we expected only light alien resistance inside the compound, there was no telling what we'd run into. This was, after all, an alien soldier manufactory, where their genetically engineered troops were raised in, I don't know, I guess I expected tanks or something like it. We had timed the growth process to just over a month, but for all we knew, the entire factory could be full of sleeping soldiers waiting to be activated with the press of an alarm. The larger hallway was clear of movement, and we followed it. Our group split in two halves, which walked down opposite sides of the hallway. We ran into multiple doors of some sort, but we couldn't find a way to open them, so we ignored them and hoped they wouldn't just burst open with aliens behind us. We were on a mission to destroy the alien facility from the inside, and each of us carried a pack heavily laden with C4. We hoped to find a fuel or energy reservoir of some sort. We still weren't sure how the aliens powered their facilities, but it seemed to be clean energy of some sort. Whatever their power source, a place this big would require energy storage in the form of batteries, and those would be highly energetic, hopefully energetic enough to bring the place down. We were doing a job for 2 squads, but out of nearly a dozen, only us and a half of another squad had made it to the target. The other squad was outside, helping our locally recruited partisans distract the aliens. With so few explosives between us, we probably would never bring the entire place down unless they powered the facilities with giant vats of highly explosive gases, which I doubted. So the Major decided if we couldn't find their energy storage, we'd just hit the equipment they needed to create and raise their troops, whatever the hell that looked like. I just imagined huge vats full of fluids, but only because that's the way I'd always seen it in science fiction. There was a hard left turn up ahead, beyond which I could hear the hum of machinery, which seemed like a good sign. With the turn on my side of the hallway, I moved up to the corner while everyone else waited until I could clear it. I got to the corner and slowly leaned around it, leading with my rifle. The basic rule of close quarters battle is that wherever your eyes look, so does your rifle barrel. And that's when the alien ran into me. It was a small creature, maybe 2 feet tall, with greenish skin. Its little body had a big round belly with an equally large round head on top. It had no hair or ears that I could see, and only 2 small holes for a nose. Its eyes were huge, like an elf's, but perfectly round, and aside from really big pupils, you could see the white like in a human eye. The thing was turning the corner at the same time I was leaning out to look around it, and crashed right into my knee. I reared back in my surprise and brought my rifle down by instinct, but the creature simply bounced back, then immediately moved around me. It was followed by 6 others that all looked the exact same, and every last one ignored me and the rest of the squad on the other side of the corner. The Major hissed out a quick, "Hold your fire," when we realized the things weren't being hostile in the least. Matter of fact, they only seemed aware or interested enough to walk around us to go on their merry little way. And they did seem merry with their little waddle as they walked. Reminded me a bit of chubby, hairless Ewoks mixed with giant frogs. Kershane kept them covered to make sure they didn't suddenly change their mind as they waddled down the hallway. We decided to let them go. Better to risk them raising the alarm later than us doing it now by wasting them with gunfire. But our creatures had barely seemed sentient. No sense of alarm, no obvious awareness or care to our presence. When they disappeared through one of the doors we'd been unable to open, the group let out a sigh of relief, but nobody talked. We maintained our discipline and continued our search. The turn in the hallway led to a large room full of strange equipment. There were several things that looked like workstations similar to what we'd seen at the Elf facility where we'd gotten the intelligence that led to this raid. But these workstations were shorter, about half the height of the ones we'd seen the Elves operate, yet too tall for the strange frog Ewok creatures. Nothing here looked like it had anything to do with genetically engineering soldiers, though, so we ignored it and moved on. It didn't take long to find the Chamber of Horrors itself. We took another large hallway that seemed promising and past another few small doors we could find no way of opening. The hallway eventually ended in a T intersection. The path on the left likely led to the main entrance, as we could hear the sounds of combat coming from that way. The path in front and to our right both ended in huge doors, with a box-like mechanism on the wall to the right of each. We wouldn't have to worry about how to operate it, however, as suddenly the door in front of us whisked open surprisingly fast for doors of that size and mass, putting us face to face with a squad of elves. Noise discipline went out the window. Unlike the elves, we were moving tactically, eyes and rifles forward. When the door opened, the elves still had their rifles down at their sides. The roar of gunfire was deafening, and in the dim light, the flash from our barrels would have been blinding to look at. The elves dropped into a heap of bodies. Beyond the door could only be what we were looking for. They were using tanks. I'd been right. But instead of hundreds of individual tanks, there were just 3 very big ones. Each tank could have probably held the contents of a dozen Olympic-sized swimming pools, and they were all filled with a clear liquid that seemed to be in a constant state of effervescence. From the top of each tank, what seemed like wires, tendrils, snaked down into the water and branched off into dozens of offshoots, each ending with a tiny little bulb. If, as I suspected, each of these was a brand new embryonic soldier, this massive room could generate hundreds of soldiers, maybe even 1,000, in a matter of weeks. My awe was broken by the sound of elf hooting. We appeared to have interrupted another group of elves working inside the massive room when we made our very loud and unexpected entrance. They immediately reached for weapons and began to fire at us as we rushed forward to take cover behind equipment. I still wasn't sure what the elf rifles fired, but I knew they could penetrate body armor and light cover, so I chose a very solid-looking computer bank to duck behind. Kershane bought us some time to seek cover by laying down a burst of suppressive machine gun fire. One of the tanks took multiple hits, but other than a clear dent where each bullet had hit, seemed undamaged. I popped up to take aim and blasted an elf who'd not done a good job of seeking his own cover. I could hear the familiar, slow but steady rhythm of Angelos firing from somewhere behind me. She wielded her M4 much like her sniper rifle, taking few but very accurate shots. One of the elves hurled a small, round object at us, something I'd never seen them use before. My brain had just enough time to think, well that's new, before my body took over and forced me to duck behind my cover. But what came next wasn't a bang or a boom, it was a roar, like sticking your head into the middle of a Category 5 hurricane. My brain felt like it would explode. I dropped my rifle and fell to my hands and knees, clutching my head. Blood was trickling down my nose. It'd be a few more seconds still before I realized I was screaming. The grenade had landed a good 10 feet from my position on the other side of my cover. God knows what would have happened if it landed right next to me. Suddenly, Wood was by my side, lifting my head up to look into my eyes. He started checking me for wounds, and I could barely hear him over the roaring in my head. "Are you okay? Are you hurt?" Finally, after another few seconds, the roar receded and I could finally shake my head no. I wasn't all right, but I was functional. I picked my rifle back up and after a moment popped up to return fire. My vision was slightly blurry. It was difficult to take aim. I lined up an elf in my sights, but he dropped from someone else's shot. I looked for another target and blasted an elf near the wall, hitting him in the side and wounding him. I could hear his melodic hoots of pain over the sound of gunfire. I popped back up, hoping to finish him off, when I saw something incredible. It was the frog Ewok creatures, 2 of them. They were mindlessly strolling across the room, completely oblivious to the gun battle. The 2 reached the wounded elf, and the alien began to hoot in what sounded like alarm. But the 2 frog Ewoks ignored him and simply started to drag him toward a hatch set near the floor on a nearby wall. Upon reaching it, the elf's hoots became more frantic, but the emotionless creatures ignored it as the hatch opened on their approach, and they proceeded to shove the elf inside. The elf was too tall and gangling for the hatch, but that didn't stop the strange creatures. The hoots of alarm turned into shrieks of pain as they pushed with incredible strength, literally shoving the elf through the too small hatch. I could hear the sickening sounds of limbs breaking as the elf finally popped through and disappeared to God knows where. Another pair of creatures approached a dead elf, but one of them was winged by friendly fire. The creature didn't scream or let out any indication of pain, even as it began to bleed green blood profusely onto the floor. It kept trying to pick itself up and drag itself to the dead elf that its partner was now moving toward one of the wall hatches. But then another pair of the creatures showed up and began dragging it to a hatch. The wounded creature never let out a single sound of protest. Soon the gun battle was over. Elf weapons were more powerful but much less accurate than our own, and our training was superior. At least for now. Each new generation of soldiers created by this facility built on the lessons of the last generation, making them just a little bit better and a little bit more proficient. The rest of the group now watched in disbelief as the frog Ewoks dragged the dead and wounded to the hatches and shoved them through, often with the sickening crunching noise of breaking bones. But the Major snapped us out of it. "Move! Every elf in this place knows we're here now. Wood, see if you can do something about barricading that door. Rest of you take out the tanks. Start planning charges." At that moment, a figure dashed out from behind cover, running toward the rear of the massive room. It looked like an elf, but much shorter, about half the height, and a hell of a lot more nimble. We gave chase immediately, but we couldn't get a clear line of shot. The creature ran around one of the massive tanks and toward another large door in the back of the room. It ducked and dodged around equipment and workstations, making it impossible to line up a shot. Hot on its heels, we burst through the doorway just a few seconds after it, rifles up and ready for what was on the other side. But the creature seemed to trip and tumble, smashing into a far computer bank with a loud thud. We were on top of it before it could get up, staring down at yet another strange variant of alien invader. This one was different though, and very obviously in charge. While the elves we fought on the battlefields around Earth were all genetically engineered clones, this creature was very much an individual. It had an intelligence in its large black eyes, and wore what I could only assume were the equivalent of civilian clothing for this species. It was fast, too, reaching for some kind of keypad on its wrist and pressing a button. The Major kicked the creature's hand away just a moment too late, as massive steel shutters in front of us began to open up. He stepped on the creature's hand to pin it to the floor, and brought his rifle up to greet whatever the shutters would reveal. It wouldn't be fair to call them zombies. Zombies don't have chitinous plates of armor that cover vital parts of their bodies. Zombies also don't have giant bone-like blades that protrude from their forearms. But whatever these creatures were, it was very obvious they had once been human, even if it was difficult to see things like facial features through all the chitinous bone armor that enveloped their heads. The creatures exploded out of the large cage they'd been kept in with a horrible shrieking noise. They were fast, incredibly so, as they leapt forward on all fours in unnatural spider-like run. The first 2 rounds simply cracked tough chitinous armor, with the third finally punching through. The creature shrieked and leapt through the air as the rest of the squad engaged its friends. I barely managed to duck out of the way as it took a wild slash at me with one of its massive scythe-like blades. The moment the thing hit the ground, it was already spinning around, and I met it with the barrel of my M4 at point-blank range. The armor exploded into splinters as I pumped the rest of my magazine into its face, and the creature finally died. I dropped the mag and quickly reloaded as I heard the Major shout out in pain. He dropped one creature, but a second one leapt from behind it and lashed out, catching the Major on the side as he tried to jump out of the way. He lashed out with his other blade, and being too close quarters to bring his rifle up, the Major used his M4 to parry the blow. The monster brought up its other claw and would have finished the Major off if I hadn't unloaded 3 bursts of 5.56 into the creature's back. It stumbled, but it didn't die, so I jammed my rifle into a chink between its armor plates and squeezed the trigger on burst fire mode. The thing shuddered once and fell dead. The fight was over in half a minute, but the Major was bleeding pretty bad, and Wood was tending to an equally nasty gash on his thigh. The short alien's hand was crushed from the Major, who despite the assault had kept it pinned down and unable to move. What the hell were those things? Angelos looked slightly panicked, her eyes darting back and forth as if expecting more to pounce out of the darkness. Ask that thing. He couldn't wait to sick him on us. Kershane looked furious. His body armor had taken the brunt of one of the creature's claws, and the plate behind the Velcro was clearly broken. If it hadn't been for him and his M249, they'd have probably overwhelmed us though. The Major stepped off the alien's hand, which immediately began to hoot in obvious pain as it clutched its ruined appendage. Its hoots were similar to the elves, but a bit harsher in tone. Despite having no pupils, it looked at us with what could only be pure hatred, which was new. The elves seemed capable of expressing pain, surprise, and fear, but I'd never gotten the impression they actively hated us. They seemed more to me like biological machines, suspicions which this facility was quickly beginning to confirm. Major Holbrook leaned down to look into the creature's eyes, rifle leveled at its chest in case it thought about pulling any more surprises. This one's different. Seems to be in charge. Plant the charges, we're taking him with us. Major, you might want to look at this. I'd taken the time to inspect one of the dead monsters and immediately regretted it. The Major nodded at Wood to cover our captive as he came over. Sir, they're definitely human, or at least used to be, but the creature's head was covered in multiple chitinous plates. It was hard to tell how it even saw, if it even used its eyes at all, but moving 2 of the plates aside revealed the all-too-human mouth, which was full of teeth wrapped in braces. Major, it's the boy the elves took from that family 3 weeks ago. He wore braces. The Major sized the creature up. It's probably just over 5 feet tall, same height as an adolescent just reaching maturity. A deathly chill ran down my spine. Every town we'd come across behind enemy lines had its military-age population killed, leaving only children and elderly. Now we knew what happened to the children when they reached adolescence. Sir, that's not it! Look! Angelus was searching our rear half of the tank room and was now pointing up at one much smaller tank that seemed connected to the main tanks by piping. This individual-sized tank was full of a brownish liquid, unlike the main tanks, and at the bottom lay several false teeth, a plastic hip, and what were obviously pieces of shrapnel. I think we found our missing war veteran. Angelos' eyes were hard as steel as she glared at our captive. Jesus, the thing dissolved him, and it took that kid in. Kershane's eyes ran back and forth from the tank and the bodies of the creatures we just killed. The little frog Ewok creatures were already at work disposing of them. Too late, I saw Kershane turn the muzzle of the M249 on our POW. Fuck this thing! At close range, the stream of 5.56mm turned the unarmored, diminutive alien's chest inside out. It was dead before it could even react. Despite his injury, the Major lashed out, knocking the machine gun out of Kershane's hands. He followed with a punch that rocked Kershane backwards, then quickly moved to trip and knock him to the floor. Holbrook stood over Kershane, rage in his eyes. Your quick temper might have just cost us the war. Do you have any idea what sort of intelligence you just denied the entire war effort? This could be it. The species behind the Elves, behind the invasion itself. You absolute fool! I moved close to the Major, fearful he'd reach for his sidearm, but after a moment the Major backed up, then reached a hand down to Kershane. Get up! Fury, but shame played on Kershane's face. Reluctantly, he took the officer's hand. That thing, it doesn't matter, it's over. There's no way the Elves don't know we're here now. C4 on the tanks. Space it 20 feet apart. Anything left over, you stick on any piece of equipment that looks important. You got 3 minutes, people, then we're out. I'm tired, so make this quick. The Major sat on the edge of an old-school teacher's desk. Our temporary barracks was an elementary school 24 miles behind the front lines. We'd arrived only yesterday after a few weeks of hiking through occupied territory. We were one of 3 squads to survive the attack on the alien breeding facility. 2 had taken serious casualties early on and had been rendered combat ineffective, forcing them to retreat. The survivors we'd linked up with and who led the distraction effort were probably dead. We never heard back from them after our hasty retreat from the facility. With the aliens swarming the town, we had no time to look for them. Turns out the Air Force hadn't been defeated, not fully anyway, but they were too hard-pressed keeping alien aircraft off the front lines to risk an attack on the facility after our deadline had come and gone. In our absence, we'd lost several more miles of Colorado, but the flat terrain of Wyoming made it ideal tank country, and while their tanks were tougher and had better armaments, ours were far better shots and better trained. The Elves had launched several very costly assaults and seemed to have expended most of their armored vehicles in the attempts to break our lines. We still hadn't found out the fate of the rest of the country. We'd been in debrief session after session, poring over every single detail of the operation for Army, Navy, and Air Force intelligence. There were even a few CIA spooks in there, but I had no clue what their contribution to the war effort was at this point. The Major had left out the part about Kershane machine gunning what could have been the most valuable captive of the war to date, but the discovery of what might have been a member of the true elf species had not been entirely surprising to the intelligence officers who debriefed us. Everything I'm about to share with you is technically classified at the highest levels, but it doesn't really seem like it matters a damn anymore, does it? The Major sighed. He'd been in at least twice as many debriefings as us and looked more exhausted than I'd ever seen him in the field. But every single ounce of intelligence was valuable. There was no telling what minor detail or observation could lead to a combat edge against the invaders. Big brains are all in agreement over a working theory pertaining to our interstellar visitors. The small elf we encounter is likely, in fact, a member of the original species. All other elves are merely genetically engineered combat drones, if you will. This is both good news and bad news. Not sure I follow. Wood narrowed his eyes. The good news is, we seem to be dealing with a species that hates to place itself directly in harm's way, and that seems to be present on the planet in very low numbers. We can draw some conclusions from this, chiefly that they are undertaking this mission with a carefully calculated cost-benefit analysis. I nodded eagerly. That reinforces our original plan. Bleed the bastards so bad the invasion is no longer economically feasible for them, given that they would have to bring in reinforcements at sub-light speed. Exactly correct. But the bad news is that if their entire military force is genetically engineered, then they'll happily grow more troops here rather than have to ship them over in a multi-year space voyage. Now I sighed, which nullifies the only real advantage we had, other than our combat veterancy, yes. Now Angelos piped up. And that too is rapidly shrinking gap as they field more advanced clones or drones or whatever. She was right. The aliens seemed to gather lessons learned from combat and distill them down to new batches of drones somehow. I noticed the elves were starting to shoot a bit straighter, and while their tactics still sucked, they were at least starting to use things like suppressing fire, cover, and concealment. There's a worm species, don't ask me its name. The big brains told me, but I forget. Scientists believe that it can learn by ingesting parts from other worms, absorbing their knowledge and experiences. It's likely the elves operate in the same way, and explains the abduction and dissolving of our Vietnam veteran. I could still remember the individual tank hooked up to the big main tanks full of brown liquid, false teeth and plastic hip replacement. I shuddered involuntarily and hoped that the old veteran's death had at least been quick. They're literally learning by melting our veterans and pumping them into their breeding tanks. There was a disgusted silence in the room for a moment before the major cleared his throat and continued. Destruction of these facilities has become a top priority, and the president has approved foregoing defensive actions in lieu of offensives against these facilities. The major didn't have to elaborate. Everyone present knew what that meant. Millions of civilians would be abandoned to capture and processing by the aliens, so that we can muster the firepower needed to attack their breeding facilities. We also have reports from across North America and Europe of sightings of genetically engineered organisms. Monsters. Now it was Kershane's turn to shudder involuntarily. The memory of the adolescents, mutated and turned into horrible creatures, was still fresh in all our minds. I'd hoped that we never have to face anything like that again. Call them what you will. Sightings are increasing in frequency. Wood nodded grimly. Makes sense. These aliens are obviously masters of genetic engineering. It only makes sense they'd develop combat platforms from native stock to offset their material losses. What the hell are you talking about? Angelos had been particularly shaken by the chitinous plate-covered creatures we fought. Like her, the thought of these things becoming main players in this war was deeply unsettling, especially knowing how the aliens were making them. You can only truck in so many tanks, rifles, APCs, etc. via spacecraft that can only travel at sublight speeds, and they've taken huge losses in vehicles alone. I'm sure they've got plans to replace them in situ, but gathering materials, building the factories, raising a workforce, that all takes a lot of time. You can genetically engineer weapons though. Well, we already know they can raise an entire generation of soldiers in just over a month. The idea was incredibly unsettling. I'd been in battle against elf tanks and APCs. I preferred that any day of the week over fighting monsters. Wood's right. The major interrupted the outburst in murmurs from Angelos and Kershane. Expect to see more and different types. Types, sir? Chinese paratroopers apparently took down something the size of a small house in Hong Kong a few days ago. They're being stingy with the intel. Bastards are still acting like there isn't a global war going on. I thought about a creature like the ones we fought, but the size of a house. It's good to know the enemy was running out of tanks. It was deeply troubling to know that they were replacing their tanks with house-sized monsters. All right, listen up. You got a few days R&R. I suggest you enjoy them because we're going back out. The major tossed an iPad over to me. Look it over, then pass it along. There were a few different satellite images on the iPad. It was a city, that much was obvious, but the destruction was making it difficult to identify. As I swiped to the last image, though, I could see the telltale collapsed remains of the Washington Monument spilling all over the National Mall. Kershane leaned over and let out a low whistle. Welcome to Operation Cryptic King. Lady and gentlemen, we're retaking the Capitol. The room sat in stunned silence. Sir, wasn't that place wrecked? I voiced the obvious question. Doesn't matter. No matter what way you cut it, we're losing this war. And people know it. The soldiers on the front know it. The millions trapped behind enemy lines know it. We need to give the country, the whole damn world, a victory to rally around. So we're retaking Washington, D.C. no matter the cost. Just us five? The major kicked out at the leg of the chair that Kershane was balancing back on. The chair fell over, sending him sprawling on his back. No, dumbass. We're going in first. Mission is to recon the area and make contact with local resistance. When contact with resistance is made, the initial recon report is relayed back to friendlies. We're going to find and shut down the local breeder facility. Wood gave off a long, slow whistle. That's a hell of a task, Major. Yeah, isn't that a job for like special forces or something? I was quick to join in. The Major paused a moment, looking at the teacher's desk he was sitting on, spotting a sticker of a smiling sun saying, "You're number one." He peeled the sticker off the desk and then pressed it against my uniform. There you go, Sweet Pea. Feeling special now? Here's the truth. We're one of a handful of teams with extended experience behind enemy lines. Hell, we might have more experience than the whole shit show and caboodle, so we're going. Get yourself a few days R&R. Enjoy it. Contact your family if you can. And with that, the Major stormed out of the room, leaving us no time to voice the 100 questions and doubts we had. We had rest, but hard to relax knowing you're flying straight into the heart of occupied territory for a suicide mission. Our task remained classified, which seemed silly, considering only a dozen humans on Earth could even speak the Elves' language, so who would the rest of us tell? But Command gave us several perks due to our mission, including priority bandwidth for contact home. My parents were still safely in Seattle, The NorCal defenses had held, and the aliens were breaking themselves against an insurmountable mountain defense, trying to penetrate the Pacific Northwest. Bigfoot remained safe, I joked to my parents. They didn't get it. They were concerned about my sister. She hadn't been in contact for weeks now, but I reminded them that there was a war on, and besides, that was the Navy's way. Last either of us knew, she was in the Pacific on convoy duty, helping fight off the growing alien naval and aerial forces intercepting supply convoys across the ocean. They made me promise I'd use my temporary privileges to try to get some info. Kershane managed to make contact with his family, who safely arrived in Toronto. The Elves had launched 3 major landfalls up north, but the Canadians had refused to give an inch of defenses around Toronto. It was nice to hear that we weren't being swamped everywhere. I inquired about my sister, and a colonel with a very crisp uniform promised to do what he could. Felt strange getting so much respect and attention from someone so high, but the colonel probably knew he was dealing with a dead man. Given that I'd be leaving soon, I requested any info to be relayed to my worried parents. On T-2 days, I bumped into an aide. "Hey, you with Holbrook's crew, yeah?" I nodded. "We finally got word about Senior Airman Angelos' spouse. He was attached to an Army infantry unit. They retreated after taking significant casualties. Last record we have is the leftovers got retasked to reinforce a Marine unit in the Denver suburbs. We haven't heard of any survivors after the city fell." I felt the lump in my throat, then nodded my thanks and walked away. Breaking the news to Angelos was difficult. She didn't cry, and I don't know if it was because she still had hope or she didn't want to cry in front of her squad. In a way, it was cruel. The aide had said that they hadn't heard of any survivors. He hadn't confirmed her husband was KIA. So, yeah, maybe it was hope. That seemed crueler somehow. I clasped her on the shoulder and stood to leave. We were armed to bear and then some. We need to be. There would be no resupply once we were behind enemy lines. Each of us carried our weapons and large rucksacks stuffed to the brim. First order of business would be finding a place to stash the heavy bags. Back in Afghanistan, the insurgents called us tortoises because how slow we moved with the incredible amount of gear we lugged everywhere. I didn't know many details of the mission, like how we were getting there, for instance. I expected more helicopter rides, one hair's distance from the treetops so we didn't get shot down. What I hoped wouldn't happen is that we'd somehow walk there. My back was already aching from the heavy pack, and when I asked the major, he just smiled. Moments later, I found out. The Brain Boys reverse-engineered some of the aliens' materials, built this toy with it. We were walking on the flight line toward what I can only describe as a large black diamond. About the only thing I recognized about it was what looked like 2 rockets strapped to its sides. A small ramp led up to its belly, and as we approached, I saw that the diamond was much roomier on the inside than it appeared on the outside. There were 6 seats, but they were all along the inner edges of the diamond, facing each other and the open ramp leading down. I couldn't see a seat for a pilot or a cockpit anywhere. I tried to voice my questions but was shooshed down by one of the techs working on the strange aircraft. He led me to my seat and strapped me in, then secured my rucksack to a special compartment on the floor. I was not reassured by the fact that my seat straps made me feel like a NASCAR driver. I was very firmly secured, and to be honest, I hoped that there'd be someone at our destination to undo all these straps, or I'd be stuck in my seat forever. The first hint that we weren't going to be spending our entire trip in the atmosphere came when the tech fitted an oxygen mask to me. With a final thumbs up, the last tech exited the small cabin and the access hatch sealed behind him. It was pitch black for a moment before a red interior light kicked on. The first thing I saw was Major Holbrook's smiling face. "Heh, hope you kids ain't afraid of roller coasters. Now go see how this all began with I survived 100 days of an alien invasion, or click this other vid instead."